and Justice, and we put on the Peace and Justice film series every week of the school semester, and we screen a wide range of films on a lot of peace and justice issues. There are a small number of schedules in the back if people are really interested. Additionally, our website is www.peaceandjusticefilms.org if you want more information, or please come and talk to me after the lecture. But we often leave our films asking the question, so what do we do? There are these huge issues, global warming, coal trains, just everything. Everything is going on. What do we do? And that's why we are so happy to be a co-sponsor of this lecture, because I believe this local movement is really a solution to some of these larger problems. With that, Susan will introduce our...
Well, good evening. My name is Susan Stubblefield, and I'm a member of We the People Missoula. Thank you very much for coming out on this first Friday to hear this public lecture by Paul Cienfuegos. I'd like to thank all our co-sponsors and local business donors who helped to make this lecture and weekend workshop possible. Please support the organizations and businesses listed on your brochure. And thank you very much to those individual donors who were generous in their support of this weekend's events. You really came through for us, so thank you. It's been a journey to plan this weekend and to bring Paul here. I'd like to thank the people who made this journey possible. Brian, Celeste, Claudia, Hermina and Bob of the North Missoula Community Development Corporation, and Paul himself. Thank you everyone for your hard work and for your vision. I look forward to the benefits this weekend will provide for our community. Tonight I'm delighted to introduce Paul Cienfuegos. I first heard Paul speak on alternative radio on a Monday afternoon last fall. It was about the time the Public Service Commission was holding hearings on the proposed sale of our water utility, Mountain Water, to the Carlyle Group. And as most of you know, that sale was finalized in December of 2011. I lost my place. Okay. I was busy organizing some materials for a friend, so I was preoccupied as Paul's talk began. But almost immediately, I was compelled to give full attention to his message. I grabbed a sheet of paper and started taking notes. By the time Paul's talk was finished, I knew we needed to bring him to Missoula. Paul has been a community organizer and educator for more than 30 years in Britain, Canada, and the United States. In the early years, Paul engaged in conventional single-issue activism, working through the standard regulatory system in hopes of effecting change. Then, after being exposed to the works of Richard Grossman and the program on corporations, law, and democracy, Paul recognized that almost every issue he had worked on throughout the years had been a symptom of corporate rule. Paul recognized that, pioneering a whole new approach, Paul helped the city of Arcata, California, to pass a ballot initiative in 1995 that created the City of Arcata Committee on Democracy and Corporations. This committee was the first of its kind in the United States. It was created to ensure democracy or democratic control over corporations conducting business in the city of Arcata. Paul served on this committee for a number of years and chaired it for several years also. You can find out more about Paul by going to his website, and that information is listed on the brochure. Also on the brochure is information about our workshop this weekend, and if you are interested in attending the workshop, Brian, back there in the yellow shirt with his hand up, will be back at the table, the book table with Will, and you can talk to him about it. And Paul has a bookstore called 100 Fires Books, and he brought a number of books with him tonight that can help and deepen your understanding about the topics he's presenting this weekend. So please, at the end of the lecture, go up there and take a look. And now, please welcome Paul Cienfuegos.
Thank you so much. Is that good for that? Okay. Thank you so much to all of the folks who helped. Organizing an event is an enormous amount of invisible work that goes into organizing an event. If you've ever done it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So thank you to all the people who not only organized it, but were here an hour early to set up the room in all sorts of ways. So thank you all. I'd like to begin tonight by asking you some questions. When was the last time that you remember being asked by the people who run your local chain supermarket how you felt about them filling most of their shelves with highly processed foods that were shipped an average of thousands of miles to get to you? When was the last time that you remember being asked how you felt about your supermarket selling thousands of items containing genetically modified ingredients that had never been properly tested for their health effects? Or being asked how you felt about them paying the farm workers who harvested the fruits and vegetables that were sold there a wage that very few U.S. citizens would ever be willing to work for? And what if it wasn't just you who felt that way? What if it turned out that the vast majority of shoppers at that store didn't want it selling GMO foods or mostly highly processed foods from far away either, and would much rather have products filling the shelves that were grown or produced locally or regionally, and really did want the farm workers to be paid a living wage? Would that matter? Would the majority's desires have any impact? When was the last time you remember being asked by the people who run your local electric utility how you would like them to spend the money you pay them every month for your electricity? Year after year, their directors make one decision after another on how to spend your money. They get to choose between year-end bonuses for their CEO and directors, or offering discounted solar panels to their customers, or deciding to build a new coal-fired or nuclear power plant, or lowering everyone's rates, etc. The decision is left totally up to them. And rarely does a single customer ask themselves why the directors get to make these decisions, rather than it being democratically decided by those who pay their bills. You folks here in Missoula are among a tiny number of towns in this country with an electricity cooperative providing your service. So this specific question doesn't relate to you in quite the same way. You already have a voice.
No, we don't have a cooperative.
When was the last time you remember being asked by the people who run your local... When was the last time you remember being asked by the people who run your local corporate chain daily newspaper how you feel about them printing very few letters to the editor that they receive? Or how you feel about the owners of your local newspaper prioritizing shareholder returns rather than hiring enough reporters to ensure that local residents get the news and analysis they need every day to fully participate in their role as citizens? And what if the vast majority of the people who read that daily newspaper wanted to see major changes in the direction of more accountability to the community, a hiring of more reporters, opening up the editorial board so that it began to include not just Republicans and Democrats, but also Greens, Libertarians, and Independents of all stripes? Would it matter what the majority of readers wanted? When was the last time that the folks who own and manage the company you worked for asked you whether you were satisfied with your job? Whether your work was sufficiently meaningful or whether you were getting bored and wanted to switch to another job within the company? Or asked you if you wanted to participate in the decision-making process about how the company's profits were going to be spent next year? What if the vast majority of the employees at your company wanted the same things you wanted? Would that matter? When was the last time the folks who own your health insurance company asked you what services you wanted to have covered under your health insurance policy? Or asked you whether you preferred to continue being part of a for-profit healthcare system, or whether you would prefer to be part of a not-for-profit healthcare system that provides affordable health care for all who need it, similar to what already exists in Europe, Cuba, and Canada? What if the vast majority of the people insured by your company wanted the same thing that you wanted? Would that make any difference? Does it matter what the vast majority of us want? My guess is that pretty much every last one of us is so used to not being consulted in the endless and critical decisions that corporate boards of directors make day in and day out, decisions that affect all of us in big ways, that it doesn't even occur to most of us to even think these questions, let alone to actually complain about it. Most of us have internalized the assumption that having no say is normal, even when it affects the vast majority of us in a nation that is based on majority rule. Now, I've only given examples so far of corporate decision-making. Let's take a look also at government decision-making. Surely the way in which our government responds to the majority's desires must be different, right? During the entire period that candidate Barack Obama was campaigning to become president, and after he had been elected, the polls showed overwhelming support for some kind of universal and affordable public healthcare system that left no one out, what some refer to as Medicaid for all. Those same polling numbers continue to this day. How did that public opinion translate in Washington, D.C.? It's quite striking, really. Doctors, nurses, and others who supported it were not invited to testify at the congressional hearings that were held after he launched his health care proposals. Obama's list of possible options never included a serious health care for all option. It was never debated. It was never on the table, even though it had overwhelming public support. This is what minority rule looks like. This is what corporate rule looks like. Let's look at another example. In Vermont, the state legislature voted in 2010 to close the state's only nuclear power plant when its 40-year license expired on March 12, 2012. The vote was 26-4. The Vermont Yankee nuclear power plant had originally been built to be safe for 40 years, if you can even call nuclear power safe. And during that 40 years had experienced very serious safety problems. So it was a no-brainer for the state legislature to make this decision. Vermont's voters were very much in agreement with how the legislature voted. Vermont is the only state in the nation with authority over its nuclear facilities. So its legislature thought it was totally within their proper jurisdiction to refuse the 20-year extension that the nuclear operator, Entergy Corporation, was requesting. Over the course of the next year, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission went ahead anyway and approved the 20-year extension. And Entergy Corporation sued the state of Vermont, claiming that the legislature really did not have jurisdiction to make this decision because it violated the corporation's constitutional so-called rights under the Commerce Clause because it interfered with the interstate electricity market, and further claiming that since the state legislature wanted to close it based on safety issues, that violated the federal government's exclusive jurisdiction on nuclear safety questions. The federal courts sided with Entergy Corporation, stating that, quote, "The safety of nuclear power is a federal issue, not a state issue," and is requiring the state to relicense the plant for another 20 years. So much for the right of a state legislature to try to protect its citizens from the very real threat of a nuclear power accident. On February 18, 2012, Vermont's Attorney General appealed the federal judge's ruling, escalating a 2-year battle over states' rights and atomic energy. And by the way, the Vermont Yankee plant is the same vintage and design of the #1 reactor at the Fukushima Daiichi plant in Japan. You can't make this stuff up. This is what minority rule looks like. This is what corporate rule looks like. Let's look at one final example. The people of 30 New Hampshire communities have been adamantly opposed for some time to the building of a massive new transmission line for electricity to be sent from Quebec in Canada into New England. It's called the Northern Pass Project. In March 2011, in their annual town meetings, voters passed resolutions in all 30 towns demanding that the transmission lines not pass through their communities, their local pristine forest lands, and farmlands. How big was the majority that voted against the project? In almost every one of those 30 towns, regardless of whether there were 300 voters or thousands of voters, the vote was unanimous. The people of rural New Hampshire said no. Almost every single one of them said no. Did the governor of New Hampshire stop the project? Of course not. Once again, majority rule turned out to be irrelevant. I could offer one example after another after another. You already know these stories. You hear them every day in your own communities. We participate in the ways we've been taught to participate. We vote, we sign petitions, we write letters to our elected representatives, we march. The list of what we do is long. But no matter how hard most of us work, it doesn't seem to add up. We mostly lose. What the majority of people wants usually doesn't seem to matter to those who ultimately make the decisions that affect all of us. It's no wonder so few of us engage in the political process. We're run down, we're exhausted. We feel hopeless and helpless. Many of us get angry, many feel despair. Many of us just go numb and stop paying attention to the news altogether because we no longer believe that anything we could do would make any difference at all.
Hear, hear.
I would argue that that's not apathy. Instead, I would argue that it's a perfectly rational response to a system that clearly is not interested in what we want, in what the majority wants. Did you, the good people of Missoula, want your local water utility to be owned by a California corporation?
No.
And this California corporation just sold your local water to the Carlyle Group, the world's largest private investment firm, which has never owned a water utility until now. Imagine that. The Carlyle Group now owns Missoula, Montana's local water utility. They can toss your local water, your local aquifer, from corporation to corporation, and there's very little you can do about it. No one asked the people of Missoula what you want. They didn't have to ask. The law is on their side. This is what minority rule looks like. This is what corporate rule looks like. It reminds me of what it feels like when bullies stole my cap when I was a kid and tossed it back and forth between them. I couldn't get it back. They had all the power, and it made me really angry because that was my cap. But it had become their plaything. I couldn't do anything to get it back other than to beg them for it. Now the law allows giant corporations to do that with your water, like it's just a corporate toy, while the people of Missoula run back and forth begging the corporation to sell it back. That's how the system works. The law is on their side. It doesn't really matter what the good people of Missoula want. And yet, there's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. But I can feel it, and I'll bet you can too. People who've never been politically active before are rising up in hundreds of communities across this country. Regardless of what you think about the Occupy movement, it has had dramatic impact on what is being discussed in the cafes and on the front pages of daily newspapers. We are the 99% has become a slogan, a soundbite that has crisscrossed the entire country in just a matter of a few months. For the first time in decades, our politicians are being forced to discuss the obscene disparity between the richest and the poorest of us. There's a great political awakening taking place. Huge numbers of us are standing up for the first time and telling others what's going on here is unacceptable. We can't continue down this path. We have to do something. But it's not just income disparity that has people so angry. Massive numbers of us are also standing up and asking, who's in charge here? Giant corporations or we the people? what a teachable moment this is. I've been doing grassroots community organizing my entire adult life, and wow, I've never witnessed anything like this before. So much energy, so many people mobilizing who have never been politically active before. It is tremendously exciting. One of my heroes is Tony Benn, the longest serving member of Parliament in British history. Here's something he said a few years ago. I think democracy is a very radical idea. It's not accepted by communists. Stalin didn't accept it. I don't think capitalists like it because it takes power from them and gives it to people who haven't got money. If you have power, you use it to meet the needs of you and your community. And that is a very dangerous idea indeed. When we were children, we all learned in school that we live in a society that is democratic, where the majority rules, where we vote for our representatives in government and they do our bidding. What I think is going on right now across this enormous country is really profound. I think the average citizen is starting to finally wake up in large enough numbers to the reality on the ground that tells them that this story from our childhoods was a great myth, a great illusion. We the people are stirring again. And the big question is this: will enough of us understand the importance, or perhaps more accurately, the urgency of reaching outside of our comfort zones, across the boundaries we rarely cross, and doing what is perhaps the scariest thing that most of us will ever do, starting conversations with, starting to build mutually respectful relationships with, those who are not like us. What I'm talking about here is the essential first step in organizing our communities. Most of us these days think that all we have to do is activate our social networks, and we'll succeed at reaching everyone who needs to be reached. Sadly, that is not how it works. Our society is incredibly fractured, and networking is not at all the same thing as organizing. Once you've stretched yourself a bit and built relationships with new groups of people who you would not normally have gotten to know, then social networking is an ideal way to stay connected and get mobilized. But first you have to build that trust. Years ago, author Carolyn Shute, who lives in Maine, was working hard to build what she called the second Maine militia. She imagined it would be some sort of pro-people, pro-democracy local army that would try to reach out to everyone. They would carry guns, just like the Maine militia already does. But their work would be about defending grassroots democracy. She referred to them as your wicked good militia. Here's something she said about them at the time. We, the people, must unite if we are to be a power strong enough to get our sovereign rights back. We must not squabble amongst ourselves over stuff like abortions, drugs, guns, welfare, unemployment benefits, men who whistle at women, cultural differences, race, and all that. A united people must include all of us. The homos, the headers, the yuppie, the hippie, the rednecks, hairy, shaved, kinky, spiffy, the work boots, the sneakers, the black shiny pumps, the nose rings, the knit shirts, flannel shirts, pink shirts, the fat, the thin, the tall, the short, the beauteous, and the ugly. We need millions. We can't fight the corporate scheme if we are all hissing and fluffing and tuffing and snorting in little isolated groups which blame other little groups for the country's ills. She's talking about the 99%. And believe it or not, on the issue of corporate power versus we the people, we're mostly on the same side already. We just don't believe it yet. When the Supreme Court ruled in January 2010 that corporations should be allowed to steal our elections even more easily than they can now, than they could already, how did citizens react? 85% of Democrats, 81% of independents, and 76% of Republicans opposed the court's Citizens United decision. I'll repeat those statistics because they're so startling to most of us. 85% of Democrats, 81% of independents, and 76% of Republicans opposed the court's decision, giving even more power to corporations to steal our elections. The only reason that I can figure out how to explain why Democrats, independents, Republicans, Libertarians, and Greens are not already working actively together to challenge corporate rule is that our minds have been so completely colonized that we don't realize we already are the majority. Divide and conquer works. That's why a lot of you in this room really need to be leaving this hall tonight and asking yourself what you can do to reach outside of your comfort zone and start building sustained relationships with people who may not think the way you do on many topics, but on the topic of citizens versus corporate rule, you already see eye to eye. You just don't know it yet. We, the people of these United States of America, have a lot of work to do. And we're going to have to figure out how to mobilize ourselves at a rate that most of us can scarcely imagine if we are to effectively tackle the social crises and the economic crises and the ecological crises that are staring us in the face. Step one is for us to get real and stop lying to ourselves about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and in our state capitals. Our so-called representatives are doing exactly what they have always done since the founding of our nation, representing the captains of industry. It has always been this way. James Madison, the primary author of the U.S. Constitution, was quite honest about this at the time. The primary goal of government, he said, is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. I'll say that again. James Madison said, and I quote, "The primary goal of government is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority." And if you actually read the Constitution, not the amendments to it, but the original Constitution, you'll see how true this is. Our nation's history isn't pretty to look at. Most of us prefer to avert our eyes, but that doesn't make it go away. The Founding Fathers were mostly very, very wealthy men who owned slaves. When the founders finished writing the Constitution and sent copies of it to each state to be reviewed, the general response was outrage. In state after state, it was rejected. The general public had expected that it would be filled with specific rights and protections for people. But instead, it mostly protected commerce and property. It was an economic document. So the men who had written the Constitution were forced to draft a number of amendments to it, which took many years to get finalized, and which became known as the Bill of Rights. Finally, there were rights for people in the Constitution, but it took citizen outrage to get us there. For the next 100 years, only 10 or 15% of those human beings who lived in the U.S. had any constitutional rights at all. You had to be a white male and own property to be considered a person under law. The other 85 to 90% of us had no rights. It wasn't until the final years of the 1800s that enough non-persons had mobilized through massive social movement and had become legal persons with rights. Ultimately, as abolitionists organized to end slavery and to turn property into people with rights, as suffragists organized for a women's right to vote, and as white men without property organized to win the rights of persons, it became necessary for the small minority who ruled the country to find another way to maintain their control. What did they do? They worked diligently for decades, primarily via the Supreme Court, to transform the corporation from something that had been merely a tool, controlled and defined by state legislatures, to something that was to ultimately become the dominant institution of our entire society. Mostly through a supportive Supreme Court, the corporation was granted one new constitutional so-called right after another. And from that point forward to this very day, the original 10% of the people who ruled the rest of us found a new resting spot inside of and firmly in control of the corporation. So we have always lived in a minority rule society. And the sooner we come to terms with this fact, the sooner we will succeed in effectively changing this situation. You can argue that we still get to choose our elected officials. But did you know that the candidate who has the most money to spend almost always wins? And did you know that the vast majority of campaign contributions comes from corporations, not from people? So until we figure out how to build a movement from the bottom up, starting locally, to drive change upward to the state and federal level, we can't honestly claim that we live in a functioning democratic republic. If we're prepared to acknowledge this very painful truth, enormous energy can be released in some very exciting ways. Because once you stop trying to convince your so-called representatives to do the right thing, and once you stop putting your energy into trying to fight one corporate outrage at a time, it frees you up to see everything from a fresh angle. That's exactly what has been happening for the past 10 years in a growing number of communities across 6 East Coast states, with very little attention paid to it by the corporate media, which is not surprising, but also with very little attention paid to it by the independent media, which is surprising. With one exception, Yes Magazine. In 150 communities, some very conservative, some very progressive, local residents are pulling the wool out of their eyes and concluding that if they want to protect the local places where they live and that they love, they have to step outside of conventional law to do so. Because municipal governments are not allowed to pass laws that respond directly to the grandest aspirations of their residents. It's against the law. Local city councils are not allowed to ban harmful corporate activities if those activities are already considered normal and legal by state governments. This is called state preemption. And you'll come up against it quite quickly if you try to stop a factory farm from moving into your area, or a clear cut in your local woods. Local governments also run into another barrier called Dillon's Rule. That's D-I-L-L-O-N, which is the flip side of state preemption. Dillon's Rule states that local governments may only make laws in the areas that state governments explicitly allow them to. You haven't heard of that, eh? And then there's corporate constitutional so-called rights. You can't stop a Walmart from being built over there because that violates the corporation's constitutionally protected property rights. You can't stop that local factory that's been providing living wage jobs to 1,000 residents for decades from closing its doors and moving production to China because that violates the corporation's decision-making authority, which is constitutionally protected as an intangible property right. You can't ask your local city council to hold a public hearing on the human health impact of cell phone towers because just holding the hearing would violate the corporation's constitutionally protected rights under 1950s era civil rights law. And the Vermont State Legislature learned the hard way that if you try to shut down a nuclear power plant, even after its operating license is going to expire, and even though state law explicitly allows them to do this, you'll quickly discover that doing so would violate the corporation's protected rights under the Commerce Clause of the US Constitution. You can't stop corporations from throwing millions of dollars at manipulating one of our elections because that would violate the corporation's constitutionally protected First Amendment rights of free speech. What I'm talking about here isn't just what's taken place in the distant past. No, this is current. Corporations just keep winning Supreme Court decision after Supreme Court decision. This is living history that is still unfolding. And until we the people decide that corporate constitutional so-called rights are a real problem in this country, nothing much is going to change for the better. Just a few years ago, Nike Corporation's lawyers tried to get the courts to agree that corporations should have the legally protected right to lie as a subset of their First Amendment right to speak. The Supreme Court chose not to make a ruling on that request, so that one is still up for grabs. Let me be very clear here. I am not challenging or criticizing rights for people. What I'm doing is drawing a line between people and corporations. What is a corporation? Basically, a corporation is property. We're supposed to not fall over laughing when we're told that it's essential that we not interfere when the courts grant property rights to property, free speech rights to property, civil rights to property. That's like giving constitutional rights to my toaster. It's absolutely nuts. And it amazes me that we the people aren't already up in arms about this. But that's what happens when we put our attentions elsewhere, fighting one single issue after another, decade after decade, not ever connecting the dots to discover that at the root of most of our single issue battles is corporate constitutional rights. Once again, there's state preemption, there's Dillon's rule, and there's corporate rights. These three rules are what makes it literally impossible for local governments to pass laws that protect your community. And that's why local governments in 150 towns and climbing have said enough is enough. And they're choosing to step outside of conventional law to do what elected officials have given an oath to do, to represent their communities the best way they know how. What do you do when you're elected to serve on a city or town council, and what the majority of the town wants is not legal for you to pass into law? You do what the good people of dozens of rural Pennsylvania communities did over the past 10 years. They passed the Anti-Corporate Farming Ordinance, which banned non-family owned corporations from engaging in farming or owning farmland. The law they passed violated corporate rights. It violated state preemption. It violated Dillon's rule. These township supervisors had to step outside of the legal structures they were told that they had to operate within. There was no other way to protect their towns. They tried pleading with agricultural regulatory agencies, but as you may already know, regulatory agencies are not about saying no to harmful corporate activities. They're about regulating harmful corporate activities, which by definition means that they're about allowing and permitting harmful corporate activities. The farm communities didn't want the hog farms regulated, they wanted them stopped. But there was no one else to ask. There was no there. So they stepped outside of the law. They had to in order to protect their rural way of life. The laws they passed succeeded in keeping the corporate factory farms out of their towns. These conservative farmers were the spark that started this grassroots movement that is now spreading so quickly. This really is nothing new. What did the abolitionists do in the late 1800s when they were trying to end slavery? They could not turn to the law. The law enshrined slavery. The U.S. Constitution defended slavery as normal. So in their rallies, they burned the Constitution because there was no way to get justice for slaves within existing structures of law. The law was the problem. What did the suffragists do when they were trying to win the right for women to vote? They could not turn to the law. The law only talked about persons, and women were not persons. There was no way to get justice for women within existing structures of law. The law was the problem. So women entered polling places year after year by the thousands and tried to vote. And they were arrested and imprisoned and treated in surprisingly brutal ways. The people of this country have understood from the very beginning, starting with the American Revolution, that sometimes you have to break the law in order to win new rights. Quite frankly, it's American as apple pie. Since the Pennsylvania farmers banned corporate agriculture in dozens of communities, this community rights movement has really taken off. Towns in Maine have banned corporations from pumping water out of the ground to sell in little plastic bottles. Other towns have banned corporate mining, the corporate dumping of urban sewage sludge on farmland, the corporate use of the right of eminent domain to take private property away from private land and homeowners against their will, and many other examples. In 2010, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania's City Council, by a unanimous vote of 9-0, banned corporate fracking for natural gas, a practice that commonly results in turning your tap water into something that you can light with a match. Imagine that. It's not a pretty picture. The latest community to be added to this map is Bellingham, Washington, which in January 2012 launched a ballot initiative campaign that would ban coal trains from passing through Bellingham. They intend to gather enough signatures to put it on the ballot in November. As was reported in the Bellingham Herald newspaper on December 30, 2011, and I quote, "In conventional legal terms, that doesn't seem to make much sense. The federal government regulates the interstate rail system, and BNSF Railway Company has a legal right-of-way through the city," unquote. But the Bellingham organizers don't seem too concerned about that. They say that they're setting out to establish some new legal groundwork that would put the rights of communities and ecosystems above the rights of railroad corporations. Every last one of these local ordinances is doing something as revolutionary as what the abolitionists and the suffragists did. They are refusing to abide by an unjust law. They're saying in town after town, if we can't get our state and federal governments to protect us from these harmful corporate activities, we'll do it ourselves, no matter what it takes, because we live here, because we won't let our homes get destroyed, because we're drawing a line in the sand. Any town can do this. It just takes backbone. I travel extensively leading workshops and giving talks about these issues. I've been doing this since 1996. And I have to tell you, people are fed up with the status quo in this country. They are fed up with feeling powerless. They are fed up with being ignored by their so-called leaders. I've never witnessed so much readiness to stand up collectively and say, we will not let this harmful corporate activity happen here. And what's even more exciting to me is that people are taking it one step further and also starting to think about what they want for their towns. Not just what they don't want, not just what they're trying to stop, but what they want. A few communities, like the rural New Hampshire towns I mentioned earlier, are getting ready to pass ordinances through their annual town meetings in March of this year, 2012, that would enshrine under law the right to a sustainable energy future. Imagine that. 6 communities are voting on this. These residents are no longer begging state and federal politicians to pay more attention to the fossil fuel energy crisis we're in. They're not waiting anymore for someone higher up to save them. There is no legal force more powerful than we the people, and they know it. Let me read you section 1 of this ordinance being discussed in the town of Lancaster, New Hampshire. And as you listen to this, think to yourself how exciting it might be to do this sort of thing in your town. The residents of the town of Lancaster recognize that the current energy policies of the state of New Hampshire and the United States have long been directed by a small handful of energy corporations and the directors of those corporations, and that centralized control over energy policies forces reliance upon unsustainable industrial-scale energy production and denies the rights of residents to a sustainable energy future. The residents of the town of Lancaster recognize that environmental and economic sustainability cannot be achieved if the residents of community majorities are routinely overridden by corporate minorities claiming certain legal powers that bar meaningful regulatory limitations and prohibitions concerning the generation, distribution, and transmission of unsustainable energy. The residents of the town also recognize that sustainability cannot be achieved within a system of preemption which enables those corporations to use state governments to override local government, local self-government, and which restricts municipalities to that lawmaking specifically authorized by state government. The residents of the town of Lancaster believe that the protection of their health, safety, and welfare is mandated by the doctrine of the consent of the governed and their inherent right to local self-government. Thus, the town of Lancaster hereby adopts this rights-based ordinance, which establishes a Bill of Rights for the residents and communities of the town. This Bill of Rights includes the right to a sustainable energy future, prohibits corporations from acquiring land necessary for the construction of unsustainable energy systems, or engaging in the construction or siting of any structure to be used in the operation of unsustainable energy systems, removes certain legal powers from energy corporations operating within the town of Lancaster that would violate the right to a sustainable energy future, and nullifies state laws, permits, and other authorizations which interfere with the rights secured by this ordinance. What do you think of that? I'm going to borrow a phrase that I love that's frequently chanted in marches against corporate rule in this country. This is what democracy looks like. How many people in the hall have heard that chant before? Raise your hand. Let's chant it together 3 times, okay? This is what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. Thank you.
I think that was the WTO, Seattle. They gave it.
What we are witnessing, I believe, are the opening shots of the Second American Revolution. The central question that each one of these towns is asking themselves is this: who's in charge here? We the people or large absentee corporations? They know who should be in charge here, so they're standing up for their communities and exercising their inherent right to govern themselves. And they're not going to allow higher levels of government to stop them from passing stronger protection of their farm and ranch lands, stronger protection of their creeks and rivers, stronger protection for working people, stronger protection for neighborhoods, because that's what a majority of them wants. Let me read to you the first few sentences of the Montana State Constitution, which, by the way, is the highest law of the land in Montana. Article 2, Declaration of Rights. Section 1, Popular Sovereignty. All political power is vested in and derived from the people. All government of right originates with the people, is founded upon their will only, and is instituted solely for the good of the whole. Section 2, Self-Government. The people have the exclusive right of governing themselves as a free, sovereign, and independent state. They may alter or abolish the Constitution and form of government when they deem it necessary. Section 3, Inalienable Rights. All persons are born free and have certain inalienable rights. They include the right to a clean and healthful environment, and the rights of pursuing life's basic necessities, enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and seeking their safety, health, and happiness in all lawful ways. In enjoying these rights, all persons recognize corresponding responsibilities. These are your constitutional rights in the state of Montana.
Yes, sir.
Are you already familiar with this document?
Yes.
Every state constitution contains reasonably similar language. Earlier I mentioned that Bellingham, Washington is organizing to ban coal trains from passing through their town. If you don't already know about this, there's a corporate plan to run up to 20 coal trains per day, each train up to 1.5 miles long, and containing 100 to 150 coal cars each. That's 3,000 coal cars per day, stretching up to 30 miles long per day. They will run from Wyoming and Montana to a number of deep water ports in Oregon and Washington, on their way to China. Many of these trains are destined to go through Missoula, as well as through Spokane, Everett, Seattle, Tacoma, Yakima, Longview, Vancouver, Hood River, Portland, Salem, Eugene, and many other towns and cities on numerous routes. Ports are already being dredged to handle these massively heavy ships in Cherry Point north of Bellingham, in Grays Harbor west of Olympia, in Longview and St. Helens on the Columbia River, and in Coos Bay on the Oregon coast. I'm helping to establish a network of communities that are considering passing the same ordinance that Bellingham has written, with the goal of stopping this entire operation before it even starts. So please contact folks you know along these routes and let them know that there's something very powerful that they can do, beyond just pleading with elected officials. The time for pleading is over. It's time for us to stand up collectively and exercise our right to say no to what we find unacceptable and to say yes to what we actually want. Coal is the worst of the fossil fuels for releasing carbon into the atmosphere that creates catastrophic climate destabilization. So if we care about our climate, this project has to be stopped. Each coal car is expected to release upwards of 500 pounds of coal dust as it rumbles along. Up to 500 pounds of coal dust release per train car. Imagine the health impacts of that much coal dust in the air, in the creeks, in our lungs. More than 170 Bellingham doctors have already mobilized to warn their community about this new health menace. In their own words, quote, "There are irrefutable links between these pollutants and cardiovascular and respiratory disease, reproductive health issues, and malignancy, with no threshold value for impacts on human health. Much like cigarettes, a little exposure is bad, and more is worse." Unquote. Let me be clear. It's not enough to simply stop the coal trains, although stopping them is essential. And these rights-based local ordinances can help. It's not enough to simply stop the tar sands project in Canada and related pipeline to the Texas coast, although stopping them is essential, and these rights-based local ordinances can help. It's not enough to simply stop the drilling for oil in deeper and deeper waters, although stopping this is essential. What we really need is a fundamentally new energy policy in this country. And there is no way we can get there if our entire strategy is begging and pleading with our elected officials in Washington and in our state capitals. Fossil fuel analysts say that peak oil happened just a few years ago, and it'll be a slow decline from here on out. Peak coal is right around the corner, at least domestically. Peak natural gas is closer than you may think. We're simply running out of most of the raw materials that are required for economic growth to continue. This was first acknowledged with the publication of the book, The Limits to Growth, in the 1970s. Their predictions have turned out to be surprisingly accurate. Economic growth is over on this planet. Yes, there will be fits and starts for decades to come, but the general trend will no longer be upwards. Will our politicians acknowledge this anytime soon? Of course not. So it's up to us to pay attention, to pay much closer attention than most of us are doing so far. It's up to us to lead on this issue. I'm currently reading Richard Heinberg's new book, The End of Growth. It's extraordinary, and I urge you to read it. The reason I'm focusing for a moment on peak fossil fuels is that a vast number of us already know that we need to change direction in our energy policies, and fast. What Lancaster and other New Hampshire communities are doing is an example of how we can get there, or at least how we can begin the long journey from heading off the cliff towards acknowledging that this beautiful planet that we live on has limits, and that we've reached those limits, and that we have to drive major political change upwards from local communities to state and then federal government if we're to have any chance of fundamentally shifting our energy policies in this country. The same goes for transportation policies, agricultural policies, forestry policies, health policies, environmental policies, etc., etc. I'm absolutely convinced that we have to begin by envisioning what we want here at home first, and turning that vision into local, rights-based lawmaking. In New Hampshire, it's people exercising their right to a sustainable energy future. In Maine, it's people exercising their right to a sustainable food system. And in Montana, what will it be? That's where it starts. What does a majority of Montana voters want? What does a majority of Missoula voters want? That's where it starts. When you hear a news story on the radio tomorrow talking about the policymakers who decided this and the policymakers who will decide that, ask yourself who these policymakers are. Ask yourself, why is it that you hear that phrase day after day, but it doesn't ever occur to most of us that we, the people, hold the ultimate responsibility and authority to be those policymakers. Montana is one of the more than 30 states in this country that allows the voters to pass laws directly through the ballot box. You won that right because an enormous number of people calling themselves populists organized here in the 1880s and 1890s and won that right for all of you. I'll be leading a workshop soon in Corvallis, Oregon for organic farmers, food processors, and food safety activists to help them understand how a rights-based local strategy could successfully ban genetically modified crops from being grown in the Willamette Valley. I'll be sharing with them a proposed ordinance that protects the people's right to seed heritage and sustainable agriculture. The GMO issue is yet another emergency that needs immediate attention. We, the people, cannot keep battling these totally legal but awful corporate activities, one at a time, endlessly, into the future. We do not have the time. We don't have the resources. And frankly, it's a waste of our energies, when instead we could be exercising our right of local self-governance. Instead, we could be standing up together and saying, no, you can't harm us here anymore. We have the right to say no. We're drawing a line in the sand, and we're organizing for our right to sustainable agriculture. None of what I've been describing to you tonight is easy to accomplish. Of course it isn't. But neither is all of our endless, single-issue, crisis-based activism, which rarely accomplishes its goals. For me, the central question that I keep asking in each community that I visit is this: what do you want? What do you need? You are the real experts in this place. No one knows this place better than you do. You have unique issues here that need to be resolved. You're trying to figure out how to get your water utility back in public hands. You're trying to figure out how to stop coal trains from passing through. You're trying to stop prime agricultural lands from being turned into subdivisions. In each one of these cases, a small minority of people, organized as a corporation claiming constitutional rights, is making all of the critical decisions. In most of these cases, they're not even the people who live here who are making these decisions. That's the central issue that needs to be addressed. Who is in charge of this place? The people who live here and vote here, or large corporations? Every town needs to identify the primary issues that are so contentious there. Every town needs to create authentically democratic public space so that we the people can meet and talk and listen to each other and think creatively together, so that we can find our power again as the people, so that we can learn again how to govern ourselves, so that we can think about what we want to leave for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren here in this place. We can do this. We are the people, right?
Right.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So we have some time for questions, and there is a microphone. Thank you, by the way, very much. That was amazing. We have a microphone set up in the back, in the center aisle here, and I will be absolutely delighted to answer questions. Easy questions or hard questions? Supportive questions or unsupportive questions?
I'm not sure which kind this is, but I, like everyone else here, would be just delighted to have local communities all over the world pass ordinances to protect the environment and public health and build a sustainable society and so on and so forth. But people have a lot of different ideas about what it is that people most need. I grew up in the South where almost uniformly local communities prevented black people from voting and prevented black children from attending schools with white children. And it was the mean old federal government that came in and forced change. My parents spent a long time fighting the raw sewage that flowed into a little creek that flowed through our farm. And it was the mean old federal government's Clean Water Act that finally cleaned up that creek. So while Missoulians may pass the kind of ordinances you're talking about, I think it's quite possible that a lot of communities around around Montana would say that what they want is the right to mine where they want to log how they want to use water the way they want to, even if it hurts other communities downstream of them, downwind of them, and so on. So how do we ensure that this local community movement is really making a better world for all and not just allowing a community to do what it thinks is in its best short-term interest, even if that hurts the other communities around it?
And not surprisingly, I'm asked that question almost every time I give a talk. The question is, in brief, can this community rights movement, can it not be used in communities that actually want much less environmental protection or want to stop black people from having rights, etc. Isn't that a danger of what I'm proposing? The community rights movement could be used as a legal structures, again, stepping outside of conventional law. Regulatory and zoning law is normally what municipal governments are allowed to use. As this movement builds, there is nothing that would stop a local community from trying to pass laws that do the sorts of things that the person is afraid of who asked the question. What we are proposing, and I referred to it very briefly in my talk, we're not objecting, and I hope I made this clear in my talk, we're not objecting to the state and federal governments having laws. What we're objecting to is the state and federal government telling a community that it can't have stronger protection. That's what we have now. In California, a number of years ago when George Bush Jr. was president, the California Air Resources Board for years tried to pass a law that would have required cleaner air in California. And they weren't allowed to by the federal government. They kept being blocked. Right now, the way the law works is that state and federal governments say no when communities want stronger environmental protection, stronger labor protection. It violates state preemption and federal preemption. What we want, we have no problem with state and federal governments setting the floor. That's good. What they're currently doing is they're setting the ceiling. They're saying this is as good as the rights and protections are going to get, and a local community can't do more. That's what we object to. That's what we would support in the community rights movement, is go ahead and set basic rights for people, basic rights for environmental protection, and if we want to be stronger than that, allow us to. That's all we can do. Communities are going to use these legal structures that we're starting to experiment with and exercise in whatever ways they do. And there is danger in that. But what we want is for the governments at the state and federal level to start setting floors. And that's what we want to create. Other questions?
Yes, I think, we do all feel like there are 99% of the people who don't want corporate rule. But at the same time, it's the same argument that environmentalists have faced for so many years, jobs, especially now. So while we have maybe a temporary halt of the XL pipeline, people are immediately criticizing and it's jobs. Same with the coal, and our own governor in Montana is a great pusher for coal. So how do we bring that 99% who really are with us, except they think we're destroying jobs?
I wouldn't actually agree. So sorry. The question is that your fear is that there's some limitations to what the majority would accept around environmental protection, and your understanding or belief is that there's an awful lot of people there who prefer job security over environmental protection. What I would argue is that most of the voices that are pitting workers against environmentalists, virtually all of the voices, are corporate voices, or they're higher level government voices, which in a way are corporate voices because of the nature of how people get elected to higher levels of government in this country. So one of the things that we need to do is end corporate constitutional First Amendment rights of free speech, and that would end the right of corporations to donate to elections, to lobby, to speak politically. So, we have all of these fake, they're called AstroTurf organizations, rather than grassroots organizations. They're fake corporate, nonprofit, educational organizations with names that are very convincing frequently. It would end that. It would end the lying and the propaganda that come from fake corporate, front groups. See, I just lost my train of thought, so let me just see where I was going to go with this. Let's see. So, and the other piece, I think, is that divide and conquer has been incredibly powerful in the society. If you go on my website and look at my articles and interviews, click on the articles and interviews section, you'll see an article about why loggers and environmentalists are natural allies. That's close to an exact title. And it really bursts apart the myth that jobs versus environment is anything other than a corporate frame. That's really what it mostly is. I just moved from Humboldt County, California, a year ago. which has had serious battles around clear-cut logging of old growth for decades. And before corporations took over logging and turned it from relatively sustainable plucking of trees to massive clear cuts, before that happened, the people who were loggers and the people who were mill workers, they worked seasonally. They didn't work in the rainy season, they fished in the rainy season. The loggers and mill workers were fishers before the corporations took over the logging industry, the giant corporations. Now, people who work outside in forests, who are fishers during the downtime, are not interested in clear-cutting forests. They're not. They fish. They want their kids to fish. They want their grandkids to fish. They want their grandkids to know what old-growth forests look like. It is a myth that rural people would destroy their own environment. Rural people and lower income working blue-collar workers have been forced into untenable situations by a corporate economy. And so I actually think that the jobs versus environment is a construction. I think it's corporate propaganda. And once again, I would say, reach out across those boundaries and test my hypothesis. Any other questions? Come down to the mic, yeah.
I also used to live in Humboldt County.
Ah!
I lived about 20 minutes away from Arcata by bicycle.
That's about how far I live.
And I always marveled at Arcata because Arcata doesn't have box stores. Arcata doesn't have businesses that are owned out of town. Arcata has local businesses owned by local merchants, who hire local people, put their money back into it. It works just like it's supposed to work. It's freaking amazing. And it really works. There's a Safeway store in town, but I bet it's grandfathered in. And that's pretty much it. Everything else is local, and it's a thriving economy. Eureka, which is right around the bay, got beat to hell in 2008. Arcata didn't. Arcata survived pretty nicely. So how did you do that? Because that's property rights for the capital or whatever.
I was involved, as Susan said in the introduction, I was one of the creators of an advisory ballot initiative in 1998 on the Advisory Initiative on Democracy and Corporations that asked the voters, can we have democracy when large corporations wield so much power and wealth under law? I forgot to say that the question was about Arcata and its local economy, and how did we do it? And I wish that I could claim that our committee had some profound impact on that, but in actuality, it really had happened over the 30 and 40 years prior to the creation of the committee that didn't start until the year 2000. We have had visionary city council members for about 40 years in the Arcata City Council. We have, and I can tell you very simply why. We have an active, engaged citizenry in Arcata. That's all it takes. That's all it takes. And when you have an active, engaged citizenry who's paying attention, who's actively filling, we also have, Arcata has an enormous number of committees of the city council. You wouldn't believe what we have committees discussing, official city council committees of residents. When you have that kind of participatory democracy, you don't end up with a city council that's filled with developers and real estate agents, which is what most city councils are filled with. It's about participation, folks. That's the difference. If you have an engaged, active citizenry, you elect people who serve you properly. And Arcata has had 40 years of good leadership. And that's what it takes. Now, I should also say that Eureka in one direction and McKinleyville in the other have had just the opposite kind of leadership for years. And if you're a big box store or a McDonald's and you can set up in both of those towns just a few miles from Arcata, you probably don't really need to be in Arcata too, because the Arcatans can get to you in just 10 minutes in their car. And if those two towns weren't next door, we'd have a much bigger fight on our hands in Arcata. Because if you look at Arcata's laws, under conventional zoning law, you can't make a Walmart not happen in your town. You can decide where it's going to go, but you can't say no to a big box store within conventional zoning law. And so if these big boxes wanted to come in Arcata, they would win. Ultimately, they would succeed. They might have to sue the city, but they would win that court case because you'd be violating their constitutional property rights. So in that sense, we've just been lucky also. Now, you could pass rights-based ordinances in Arcata that ban big box stores, and you'd have a very different kind of battle. And there's so many things that I try to put in each speech. I would really recommend that you go to my website and look at the other speeches that are there, because one of the things I didn't talk about is the specificity of these extraordinary rights-based ordinances. So very briefly, what makes them different than a zoning ordinance, for example, is that within the ordinance itself, it prohibits a particular kind of harmful but legal corporate activity, and that part I made clear. The parts I didn't have time to get into. It strips those particular corporations of all of their constitutional rights, and it refuses to recognize the state's right of preemption. And so, unlike, let's say, a zoning ordinance that tries to stop a big box store from coming in which case the corporation simply sues the town government, and you end up with a battle about zoning and property rights, which is not where we want to go when corporations have property rights. These ordinances are fundamentally different because they're primarily about rights rather than about big box stores. They're designed to handle a very specific kind of legal attack. In fact, a certain kind of legal attack is required because of the way the ordinance was written. The corporations have to argue in a county courthouse that that corporation has more constitutionally protected rights than the residents of the town do. They have to argue that because that's how the ordinance is drafted. And in some cases, like in Pennsylvania, where a bunch of towns have passed rights-based bans on fracking, and other towns have passed zoning-based fracking laws, and the media isn't following this closely yet. So when you read about what's happening in Pennsylvania and New York, where states are saying to local communities, you can't do this, it's going to be very interesting what happens. There's going to be a division. The ones that pass bans on fracking via zoning laws are going to immediately be tossed out as violating corporate rights. The ones that were based on rights-based ordinances, that's going to be a whole different thing. And in fact, our movement is going to be responding in Pennsylvania and New York to these states saying you're not allowed to do this locally by passing more ordinances. And we're going to force lawsuits because that's what you have to do. We're stepping outside of the law to change the law, to change the culture, to make it functionally democratic. And so you have to do that. You don't just shrivel away at the point that the courts say you can't do this. You pass more. You say, we dare you to come after us. The state legislature in Pennsylvania has passed a law that says this. So if the state, sometimes the corporations just simply go to the state and demand that the state sue the town. And what the state then has to argue, because of the nature of the ordinance, is that the people have no right to govern themselves. And that's not true, and you can prove it. You look in the state constitution, and it's very clear that we do. So again, what we're trying to create, what these do is they create a sense of a democratic uprising. It's a popular uprising. What we're trying to do is peel away the lie, right? We're taught that we are in charge, but we try to pass a law, and they say, oh, I'm sorry, little boy, little girl, go back to your room. You've been bad. We'll take care of things. And we're saying, no, we're going to force the conversation into public space. And when people in a local community hear that their state governor or their state attorney general is telling them, the people of that place, that they don't have self-governing authority, which is in complete opposition to what they learned in civics class, people are outraged. They don't go to sleep. They wake up even more. And that's the next phase of the movement. Other questions?
So what I'm hearing you say is that that the system is broken?
No, the system was designed the way it's operating.
Yes, okay. It doesn't work.
It works great
But then,
for those who designed it.
but at the same time, I'm hearing you talk about the tactics that you use and the strategy that you're talking about also use that same system. They're using laws, they're using ordinances, they're using citizens' initiatives, they're using the Constitution.
They're actually not using the Constitution. They're using their state constitutions, and they're using the
It's still a
preamble.
Constitution, right?
Well, yes, but see, under
It's
federal
still
law,
our existing system.
yes and no. The federal law,
But I feel like we've been doing that for a long time. I think probably everybody, I've seen a lot of these people in this community that have been at different rallies, different things that they've been trying to support, and they've been doing, we've been playing in the system.
you've
We've
been
been saying,
saying,
we're going to sign a petition, we're going to lobby a politician, we're going to do it. They're saying, you can do it this way, and then we're like, okay, we'll do it this way, and we're making our voice heard, right? But then, it doesn't happen. Over and over and over and over again. And we've been just sliding backwards for how long? And so I know that part of what your prescription is, I really believe in, was we the people. But part of it, I feel like we need to not keep asking the same people over and over again for permission where we already have power for them. And I know you're saying that partially, but like, I don't even know how to say it very well, but we need to ask ourselves how to do this and not make a referendum for it. We don't need to make a referendum for it. Our power is that we just need to say, this isn't okay. Don't. We don't need permission.
a little hard to paraphrase that. But what I heard you saying makes me think that you might have misunderstood a bit of what I was trying to put across. But your argument is that we shouldn't be asking permission. We don't need to be asking our leaders. We should just do it. But that's what I feel like is exactly what I am saying. That there's nowhere in the strategy that these 150 communities are using where they ask permission to do anything at all. They're simply exercising their right to pass initiatives. And I'm talking about, and you're saying the initiatives are within the system, but the reality is that if a majority of people just think privately in their heads, we don't want X to happen anymore, nothing will change. Nothing will change until you pass a law and ban X.
That's right.
Right? And so maybe you don't agree with that. It's like, but I don't know how that would change anything. I mean, the vast majority of the people of Missoula, if asked tomorrow, would say we don't want 10 miles of coal trains through our town every day for the next 20 years, right? I can't imagine a majority would say yes. If you ask the majority of Missoulians, is it Missoulians? Missoulians? If you ask them tomorrow, do you want, if we could figure out a way to get our water utility back into public hands, would you vote yes? It's hard to imagine that you wouldn't get 70–80% of the public voting yes like that.
Yeah, but we don't
But
have
we aren't
control
doing
over
that.
We don't have a choice. We didn't have a choice.
You do have
We
a
did,
choice.
at that point, it was like,
No, you didn't know that you had power.
yes.
You didn't know
Yes.
that you had power.
But we acted like we did.
You were acting powerless because you didn't know that you could step out of these legal structures and, well, you knew that you could pass ordinances locally, but you didn't realize, because you didn't maybe understand that corporate rights are not legitimate, you didn't understand that you could use the ordinance process to say no.
Yes, and maybe we did, and maybe we should, and let's do that right now. But what happened is, the Carlisle Corporation owns our water. And I need to say any more than that?
No.
They own our water. Okay, so what do? We just say, we make an ordinance and they get to honor it, and then what?
Well, you could be creating a crisis of jurisdiction with corporate rights and with the state. You could amend your state, your local charter, your local city charter, to say that the city, the population of this city does not allow its water utility to be owned by anybody other than the public of Missoula. And you could create a crisis of jurisdiction with the state government that would be very interesting. And I think that the biggest issue here, and there's other people who want to ask too, so I think we should take the next question, but I think the biggest issue here is that people feel like it's hopeless, right? And that's always, to me, the unnamed piece, is that yes, but this will never work. Yes, but the loggers will disagree, or the miners will disagree, or the blah, blah, blah. We haven't tried this in Missoula, right? There's so much hopelessness and powerlessness in our culture. Most of us have given up. Not just the lefties, but the righties too. Most people have given up, right? The system isn't broken, it's designed to make you give up, right? That's the institutional design. They don't want us participating. If they wanted us voting, they'd have elections on a Saturday. It would be like any country in Europe, and when you're born, you're registered, and when you turn 18, you vote. Period. Right? Every time you move in this country, you have to remember to re-register. In Europe, when you move, the government knows you move. They know your new address, right? Now, I guess you could say, oh, well, that's Big Brother or something. I don't know. But, you know, in most European countries, 70, 80, 90% of people vote. In the United States, 25 or 30% of us vote. Right? And you can say, oh, well, people are apathetic, but look at the structures that are in place to stop you from voting. They're extraordinary structures. Just look at trying to create a third party in this country. The barriers are unbelievable. They don't want you to vote.
Do you address trying to tackle the reining in of corporate power from the state charter basis?
So the question is, do we address the reining in of corporate power from the state charter? That was finally one I could actually repeat for the recording. Thanks. This movement has been paying attention to corporate charters ever since it was founded in the early 1990s by the Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy, POCLAD. Interesting group that's still out there. It's a think tank, poclad.org. Corporate charters were historically written one at a time uniquely by state legislatures, and they were filled with requirements and prohibitions. They were documents that legally subordinated corporations as legal fictions that were not allowed to cause harm, that were chartered to fulfill one specific purpose, and that was standard chartering procedure for the first century. And as the Industrial Revolution and the Civil War were happening in the late 1800s, and corporations started getting much bigger and more powerful, they started having enormous impact on the political process, and it's a very interesting history, but they ended up breaking through all of these barriers that have legally subordinated them underneath we the people. They were historically tools of a sovereign people. So what's interesting is, because states still revoke corporate charters all the time and have to, just because you need a legal mechanism for a corporation that literally doesn't exist anymore. There's some very basic requirements still. So for example, if you've ever incorporated a for-profit or a not-for-profit corporation, you know that once a year you have to file a form with the state. You have to tell them who's the next year's president, secretary, treasurer. There's some very basic things you have to do. It's still, as it was then, a privilege, not a right, to incorporate. By the way, the charter is just the old word for articles of incorporation, which everybody still does when they start a corporation. And because the state needs a legal mechanism to disappear a company that isn't meeting anymore, that isn't filing annually, they still revoke charters all the time. So under state law, we still have the legal mechanisms we need. What we don't have is secretaries of state who have any spine. What we don't have is a populace that knows what a corporate charter is and how it's revoked. Again, we the people are dumbed down, right? We don't know our history. We don't know our rights. We don't know our legal and constitutional authority. So all of this stuff needs to change, obviously, quite fundamentally. But just to give you an example, you remember the Enron scandal quite a number of years ago. I mean, I think tens of thousands of employees lost their entire retirement benefits when the corporation went down. It was just such a scandal. It was a disaster. Most corporations are chartered in New Jersey and Delaware because they have the laxest chartering rules. Enron was chartered in Oregon. The Oregon Secretary of State, in a matter of a day or two, could have gone to the state legislature and revoked the charter, seized the assets, and initiated criminal proceedings against the directors. We still have the right to do that under law. We just don't know we do. Right? Instead, what happened? The public didn't know that it was chartered in Oregon. The public, I mean, what a different situation we might be in today if 50,000 people had been outside the Secretary of State's office 2 days later in Oregon, demanding that the corporation's charter be revoked, assets seized, etc. Right? We are the people. We have enormous legal authority. We just don't know we do. I mean, it's tragic. I mean, it's catastrophic, really, that we don't know who we are. Yeah.
Well, I heard you a couple of answers back talking about a lot of legal battles, and I guess the question for me comes up, who pays for that? Who pays the attorneys that have to argue these? Or are they already public employees? Or do we have to raise revenue to do these battles?
So every one of these 150 towns that have passed these rights-based ordinances, this new paradigm of local law, were drafted by a public interest law firm in Pennsylvania called the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund.
Yeah.
CELDF, CELDF.org is their website. And they really are leading this movement at this point.
They are.
They are extraordinary, and they will help the community of Missoula or any community to draft the ordinance of your choice. You tell them specifically what you want, and they will hand it back to you in legal language for free. And they will then help the local lawyers if and when it's challenged. Again, 150 ordinances and counting, 5 have been challenged in a decade. These are very challenging ordinances to challenge by a corporation because you have to challenge them in a way that exposes the reality, the legal reality, that exposes the great myth of the United States about who's really running things.
What's that name again?
Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, CEL, in the brochure, CELDF.org. So, and if your ordinance gets challenged, and it's certainly possible, I mean the odds right now are it's unlikely, but it's certainly possible, they will also, for free, assist your local attorneys in preparing their legal briefs. They won't show up en masse and do all the work. They don't have, I mean, there's basically like 8 full-time people in the organization. But they will be there, to support your local attorneys. Well, they'll be there by email and phone. Yeah.
If communities manage to keep corporations from doing what they want to be doing, don't those corporations try to sue for lost income so isn't there a potentially large financial liability in trying to do something like this?
That has always been the risk anytime a municipality tries to stop a corporation from doing anything, whether you're passing it as a rights-based, outside the box ordinance or not. the right of a corporate, I didn't ask the question for the recording. I keep forgetting. So the question is about whether, isn't it likely that the corporation will sue for lost profits? And how do you deal with that? Let's see, I want to gather my thoughts for a second here. Well, that didn't help. There's a lot of information in my head that has to be organized. So first of all, that's a constitutional right. The right to claim, to collect lost profits, future, can you imagine? Corporations have won the Supreme Court the right to claim future lost profits if you stop them from doing something in your community. This is, again, a constitutional right. It's a constitutional property right. When these rights-based ordinances are drafted, so let's say you're banning corporate farms in your community. The ordinance says that corporations engaging in farming shall not possess any constitutional rights. So that's how you immunize the community directly. Now that doesn't mean that they won't try to sue, but that's a right? And you've taken it away. You said within the municipal boundaries, the city doesn't recognize that corporations have the right to ... because rights are for people, not for legal fictions. And so a corporation may try to sue, but again, they have to argue that corporations have more rights than the residents. They can't just go straight for what they want. They have to peel away, argument by argument, in a county courthouse initially, and then it can be appealed up and up and up, but it starts locally. Their corporate lawyers have to argue first and get a win that says corporate rights trump our rights. They have to peel away state preemption. Why is it that even though the state constitution says we can govern ourselves, why does the state claim the right to not let us pass laws that we want to pass? They have to argue against every one of these things in an open courtroom before they ever get to future lost profits. So again, this is very different kind of legal, this is new territory. This is totally new legal territory.
You said there were maybe 5 out of, I can't remember how many. 150 that were challenged.
Yes.
Can you speak a little bit about what happened in those 5 challenges, or maybe one of them that's most notable? And repeat my question.
What happened in the 5 communities of the 150 that were challenged? And you're not going to like my answer. I don't remember. I don't know. I actually don't know. It's a hole in what I understand about this work. And I need to understand that better. But you could go to celdif.org and write that question to them in an email, and you'll get a reply pretty quickly. Or to me, and I'll respond in the next few days after I've checked in with them. Because they're the experts in this work. The leading experts in this work.
I'm interested in the move to amend the Constitution, and I was wondering from this perspective, from what you're working on, there's a lot of different aspects to what kind of an amendment would do it. And so from this perspective, what would you look for the wording?
Oh, the constitutional, yeah.
Yeah.
So the question is, she's active with the Move to Amend campaign that's quite active around the United States, and what would the community rights movement effort be able to offer in terms of wording for a constitutional amendment? And I actually can't answer the question quite the way you're asking, because our movement actually doesn't really believe that a constitutional amendment campaign is the smartest strategy. And we believe that for a number of reasons. One is that if we put all of our eggs in one basket, well, first, a constitutional amendment campaign takes an enormous amount of time, energy, people, resources, money. And the last real example of this was the women's movement in the 1970s that was given a decade by the federal government to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. And the way you pass a constitutional amendment in this country is that both houses of Congress have to pass it by supermajority, which is 2/3. And if they can get through that barrier, then 3/4 of the state legislatures have to also approve it by majority vote. That's 38 state legislatures. And in the 1970s, given a decade to organize, the women's movement successfully got it through both houses of Congress, which was a feat in itself. And they then organized in the state legislatures, and when they ran out of time in their 10th year, they had gotten 37 of 38 state legislatures to have passed it, and the entire movement collapsed. They had nothing to show for themselves at the end. Which, I mean, can you imagine how deflating that was for you to have worked that hard for a decade? So if we put all our eggs in the basket of a constitutional amendment, and if we put all our eggs there, I think that's a huge strategic mistake. Now, if it's one strategy among many, then I wouldn't be objecting. But these campaigns take a massive amount of effort over a sustained, period of time. My other critique is that corporate rights are so entrenched in the Constitution that just passing one amendment to the Constitution doesn't actually get them all out. And the way that the Move to Amend campaign's goals are structured is to abolish corporate personhood. Well, corporate personhood started as a Supreme Court decision in 1886. Southern Pacific Railroad Corporation sued Santa Clara County in California. And that's the case where corporations started winning the rights of persons. In that case under the 14th Amendment, and it's been growing ever since. That's 1886. So the problem with framing the problem as corporate personhood is that for the entire 1800s, corporations were winning one significant constitutional right after another that wasn't about personhood. So that's problematic language and framing. I mentioned ever so briefly the Commerce Clause. Corporations started having access to the Commerce Clause in the mid-1800s. They won constitutional rights under the Commerce Clause, had nothing to do with personhood. They won constitutional rights under the Contracts Clause of the U.S. Constitution in 1819. This is pretty obscure law, but it's not that complicated when you start getting into it to understand it. I mean, a few paragraphs I'll give you a paragraph on each just so you have a basic understanding. And I'm not a trained legal person at all. I'm an organizer. But just to finish this, and I'll give you a little background, those two are absolutely critical in the development of corporate rights. They have nothing to do with personhood. So we need a reframing. If we're going to try to pass a single constitutional amendment, it should be about ending all corporate rights, not about ending corporate personhood rights. So that's a problem too, because if we're going to work for 10 or 15 years to try to get one thing passed, let's get the language as tight as we can get it. So that's a problem. And my third objection is that I'm wondering how strategically the Move to Amend leadership has been thinking in terms of, surely they must understand that a constitutional amendment that would abolish corporate personhood includes First Amendment free speech rights, which means that elected officials would no longer be able to get donations from corporations for their re-elections, which is great, but that's one of their First Amendment rights, is to donate. Money equals speech, said the Supreme Court in 1976. In Buckley versus Vallejo, Supreme Court decision, The courts ruled that you couldn't limit how much money a corporation could donate to a campaign because that would limit their right to speak to you, to speak to the voters. Money equals speech. So if you actually pass, to get the federal and state legislatures to pass these, the people who would be voting it'd be a death sentence for their reelection getting corporate money to get reelected. And I'm wondering whether we have 2/3 of the House and Senate honest enough at this point to vote yes on something like that. So that's a concern of mine too. I don't object to the idea of a constitutional amendment to challenge corporate rights, but the community rights movement's perspective is you build from the grassroots up, right? And so we actually have a goal, a long-term goal of federal constitutional change as well. But we believe that grassroots organizing always works most powerfully if you start local, and build power to larger and larger scales. And that really is the history of social movements. That's how it works. So our argument is, first, you pass hundreds and hundreds of ordinances like this in every state that you can get them passed in. Phase 2 is, in the states where a whole bunch of towns have passed these rights-based ordinances, you start doing statewide organizing to start challenging the state constitutional language, which tends to privilege corporate rights over our rights. And you get those state constitutions rewritten. And there's a movement that's been built in Pennsylvania called the Pennsylvania Community Rights Network. If you Google that, you'll get some very interesting materials. It started 2 years ago. There are dozens of communities participating who've already passed ordinances. More than 80 towns in Pennsylvania have now passed these. So they're the only state so far in the country that's ready for that phase 2 level. The Pennsylvania Community Rights Network's goal is to democratize their state constitution, to start allowing local communities to pass laws that give stronger protections. And then finally, once a bunch of states have successfully rewritten their state constitutions to be pro-democracy, then states are organizing for the final goal of federal constitutional reform, which, that's a long haul. But we actually don't think that you can just start like that at the federal level. So that's a pretty fundamental critique. And I want to see all of these things succeed, but I think we have to be thinking strategically about where we should be putting our energy. And just very briefly, I'm sorry for the long answer, but some more details. In a paragraph, when corporations want access to the contracts clause in 1819, it allowed corporations for the first time to stop state legislatures from rewriting their charters. Their charters had been defined as legally subordinating documents that defined, that prohibited, that required, ... not regulated, right? This is what you're required to do, this is what you may not do. If you don't follow these rules, we revoke your charter. We don't sue you, we don't plead with you, you're our subordinate, we dissolve you. And that was the historical nature of charters. And as early as 1819, the corporate lawyers had won a major victory that was related to, if you put the Dartmouth decision into Wikipedia, you'll get, that's the Supreme Court decision, where for the first time, corporations won more rights over their rewriting of their charters. And state legislatures had to start being somewhat hands-off once the charter had been initially written. It's a much longer story. The Commerce Clause in the mid-1800s that corporations want access to, as in brief, is that for the first time, communities, municipal governments, county governments, state governments, were told by the Supreme Court, you cannot prohibit this corporation from entering your state, selling this product, manufacturing this product, etc., because that violates corporate rights under the Commerce Clause. It was the beginning of local communities and state governments not having any jurisdictional authority to protect the health and welfare of the people. And hundreds of local and state laws were thrown out as unconstitutional after the mid-1800s. None of this has to do with corporate personhood.
There's a article on the CELTF website about the move to the event.
The
Which
CEO of Move to Event?
About the move to men, the Community Environmental Legal Defense.
Oh.
There's an article on their website about that. But my question is, are there any encouraging and hopeful examples of revoking a corporate charter? I'm thinking of Monsanto.
Yeah.
Are there hopeful examples of revoking corporate charters like Monsanto? No, not in the recent era, because we would need a state legislature and/or a state secretary of state. They have authority at this point at the state level. I don't know. I haven't asked the CELTF legal experts whether a corporate charter could be revoked through a state ballot initiative. Perhaps it could. I don't know. But again, it would have to be in the state where the corporation was chartered. And I will bet you that Monsanto was chartered in New Jersey or Delaware, where the laws are the laxest. But who knows? Maybe you'll find out it was chartered in Montana. I kind of doubt it. Let's see. Did I have? There's another piece. So yeah, at this point, there was one of these AstroTurf non-profit front groups for the tobacco industry that had been so nastily and blatantly lying. You have to understand, these are 501c3 organizations. These are non-profit, tax-exempt educational organizations with 501c3 status, which means tax-deductible donations to an AstroTurf nonprofit. It's really something. And there was a tobacco industry front group, that was being so mischievous with what it was doing that a Republican Attorney General in the state of New York revoked its charter very publicly about a decade ago. And I haven't heard of anything. The Council on Tobacco Research, I think it was called, something like that. Since then, I haven't heard of an example, and that was a nonprofit. Any other questions? All right, you have been at, you got it. Okay.
I'm a native Montanan, grown up in Butte, and
I can barely hear you.
I'm a native Montanan, grew up in Butte. If there's ever a city that some of these issues pertain to, was started 100 years ago there. But it seems like we fought the good fight there for a long time, but I'm just kind of concerned about the division that you're creating. Is there any other glue that's coming together that brings all these states? Are these cities that are working towards state, or creating laws to help locally and then moving to a state level? You mentioned earlier the law firm in Pennsylvania, but is there any other effort to organize the different communities that are working with you and the organization to help each other?
Okay, so if I'm understanding your question correctly, other than Pennsylvania that's created a community rights network formally, are there any other attempts right now to help communities that are already in existence to work together, to network together? Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay. I'm on the wrong coast, actually, to be able to answer your question. I haven't been on the East Coast for years. Pennsylvania has 80 or 100 of 150. The other 5 states are Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, New Hampshire, and Pennsylvania's, yeah. Pennsylvania has most of them. New York, New Hampshire, Maryland, Maine, Massachusetts are the other 5. There hasn't been anything passed west of Pennsylvania yet. In the other 5 states, because it's such an enormous country, I'm not following it closely enough. But there are 6 New Hampshire small communities, some a few hundred, some 1,000 or 2, that in a week or 2, as I said in my speech, will attempt to pass, and it's hard to imagine when they passed a non-binding resolution on this topic at last year's annual town hall meeting unanimously. It's hard to imagine that in a few weeks they won't pass, at least by majority, one of these rights-based legal ordinances in 6 small New Hampshire towns. That might double the number of towns in New Hampshire that have done these ordinances. So I can't really tell you. I know that I'm doing networking pretty actively in Oregon and Washington around the coal train issue, because I think that might be just the dream issue for the Pacific Northwest. You know, there is absolutely, there is some significant living wage jobs argument to make in the 4 places where the ports are going to be built. There are going to be a fair number of decent paying jobs in those 4 places. At what cost? And in all of the hundreds of small and large towns and cities that they're going to be passing through to get to those 4 ports, there's no economic development value at all. There's no jobs value at all. And there's a healthcare problem that's significant. And there's also the blockage, the severing of just being able to cross town. Because in most of these towns, the tracks go right through the middle of town. And if you have, what was it, 1.5? If you have 10 or 20 miles of trains a day going through your town, imagine how many people won't get to their doctor's appointment or pick their kids up from school or get to their local beach or whatever each day. There's going to be a lot of outrage in communities. So I'm hoping that we have in place within the next 6 to 12 months 5 or 10 communities, and please help me with this, who have said no to, or organizing to pass Bellingham's ordinance. And at that point, you've created a community rights network in Oregon and Washington of hopefully a couple dozen towns. So it might end up being organized that way. What's that?
And Montana.
And Montana. Oops. Yeah, I don't actually know. I haven't been able to find a map that shows the routes of the train that has Montana on the map. If you go to the Sierra Club's No Coal Whatever campaign, they have a beautiful full-color map, which is all over the internet. Montana's not on it. It's Oregon and Washington, so that's why I'm sounding so stupid about this. I haven't seen the map. I don't know what town. I'm told Missoula is on the route. I have not been told what other towns are on the route in Montana.
We've already had some action.
That's what I've heard. So if anybody wants to send me a map, I would be happy to start circulating that to the network. Another question?
Yeah, I might have a silly question, but about the trains.
Yes.
I have a hard time, I agree with the health hazards and the whole issue of the coal cars coming through and the amount of coal that goes in the air. But we have a city here that, as far as health, sleep is one of the most important things. The food you eat and the sleep and the air. We have a town where our council, our mayor, won't speak up about the train whistles that keep people from sleeping. So I have a hard time to see, and the neighbors I talk to, and the kids, and here we have the corporate interest too. We can pass this and there won't be whistles in town and they'll go 3 miles an hour. But that's a small issue that's easy to come together on. Now we're talking coal cars. So logistically, how do we take that bigger step really when we're not taking the small step?
Well, again, so there's two options. There's actually three options. You can propose a specific ordinance and ask your city council to pass it. You can propose a specific ordinance and ask your city council to put it directly on the ballot to the voters. You can propose a certain ordinance and start collecting the signatures you would need, which would be something in the range of a couple thousand, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, I think. I don't know exactly how big your town is. 10,000 signatures, okay. I don't know how many voters are here. And put it directly in front of the voters. And you can do that as an ordinance, or you can do it as an amendment to your city charter. And they're different processes. It's more work to amend your city charter. It's also harder for the powers that be to take it out of the city charter once you put it into the city charter. And the city charter is your local constitution. It has more legal weight than just passing an ordinance. But the biggest question is, what do you want and how do you figure that out? And that requires organizing. And it requires crossing those so-called barriers that separate left from right and working class people and more privileged people and on and on. And we have to get out of our comfort zone to figure that out. I don't really see any other way to do it.
Could we just borrow Bellingham's? I mean, is
Absolutely.
it fairly broadly written?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, these are, if you go to celdf.org, celdf.org, and click on resources and scroll down to ordinances, you will see all of their ordinances. They're 3 or 4 pages long, and there's a single word in them that you're going to go, well, that's a legal term, I don't know what that means. These are written for us. These are ordinances for we the people. Yeah. I'll let one last question happen and then I'll close, if there is one last question. Okay.
I have one last question.
Quickly, because you've asked.
Amongst your, within your vision, do you ever see this having to go the way of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, where people will actually have to stand up and get arrested and break the law and whatnot? And isn't that, will that not be part of the vision that we will need to go down in order to break this corporation?
So the question is, and I just realized I didn't ask the previous question into the microphone. Oh, sorry. This question is, will there not be the need for civil disobedience, for breaking the law in this kind of campaign? The ordinances themselves are civil disobedience. I think most likely, at least in the initial phase, the act of civil disobedience is committed either by your elected city council or by you, the voters. You're passing a law which is illegal within conventional frameworks of law. You're passing a law that violates corporate constitutional rights. You're passing a law that violates Dillon's rule and state preemption. And those are quite significant. But you're doing it anyway. And there are plenty, not just in this movement, there are plenty of examples over many decades where communities pass laws specifically to challenge the law. And what you're doing is you're creating a crisis of jurisdiction. Who's in charge here? And a very recent example that I'm sure you can easily get your heads around is medical marijuana law, which is now in like 15 states. Starting in California quite a few years ago, the federal government had always said, and still argues, that it has sole jurisdictional authority over drug policy and drug law. The voters in California voted for and passed, through the ballot box, a law that makes it legal, and Montana you have medical marijuana. So then you did it through the ballot box, yeah? Okay, so there's like 15 states or something that did this. When you passed it through the ballot box, all of a sudden Montana's governor is required, her mandate is, to defend state law, not federal law. Your state attorney general, your state legislature, your county sheriffs, your local police, they sign oaths to defend state law, not federal law. they're now all legally required to defend medical marijuana use, growing, etc., right? Because you passed this. Now, some states, those elected officials have balked. In California, they haven't. Mostly in California, they followed the law, the state law that the voters passed. The voters have the legal authority to pass anything they want in their state ballot issues, and they did. So you've now created a crisis of jurisdiction. The federal government is still insisting that it has sole jurisdictional authority, and occasionally it still swoops in and closes a marijuana clinic. And does here too, you're saying. But again, have they, are they arresting tens of thousands of medical marijuana users in Montana? Of course they're not. You've won. You've already won. Now you're going to have skirmishes for years. And sooner or later the federal government will give in. But you tell me who won this crisis of jurisdiction? Medical marijuana users and their growers, or the federal government? There are now millions and millions of legal marijuana growers and smokers in the United States. The federal law continues to be, the federal government continues to argue they have sole authority to write law on marijuana. You created a crisis of jurisdiction and the public won. That's all this is. The question is, do we have backbone? If you pass a local ordinance, then you have to be ready to defend the local ordinance. You don't go to sleep. Right? You do just the opposite. You're on guard. There was a community, it was a township in rural conservative Pennsylvania. The Attorney General contacted them a number of years ago. There's a book back there called Be the Change, which is about these Pennsylvania uprisings, a little red book. The Pennsylvania Attorney General wrote to this tiny township of like 300 or 400 people and said, I'm coming, I want to meet with your township supervisors to discuss basically you taking this off your books, this anti-corporate farming ordinance. The township supervisors that had passed the ordinance without any opposition, it was unanimous, they wrote back to the state attorney general in Pennsylvania, and there's an excerpt of their letter in the book, and they said, if the entire purpose of your visit to our township is to negotiate the surrender of our ordinance, we will not meet with you. And if you insist on passing a state law to take our ordinance off the books, we will initiate separation proceedings from the state of Pennsylvania. That's what it takes. Who's in charge here? In this town, who's in charge? Thank you very much.